So in this video, we're going to talk about this weekend's gospel reading, which is taken from John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. And the idea of these videos on the Sunday readings is, so a homily usually would involve taking maybe 1 or 2 points from a reading and elaborating on those, right? And maybe talking about how those apply to our lives and so on. So really going in depth into one thing, maybe just one phrase from the gospel. What I'm going to do instead in these videos is basically go through the whole gospel, reading it, and draw out points that you might take for meditation on your own time. And so I won't go in depth into any one of these things as I would in a homily, but rather to give just points of departure for your own reflection or your own study on this scripture. And so hopefully this can be a help towards that. The idea is not so much that you really focus on every single point in this video so much as, something might strike you. Well, if it does, then just sit with that. Maybe as you read the Gospels on Sundays, you can just take 1 or 2 of the points that really struck you and reflect on those, and to think about those points as you read all 3 of the readings and kind of see how God is speaking to you in all of those readings. So let's begin with this scripture reading, again from John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. And this is the story of the man born blind who Jesus heals. John begins, "As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?'" It's interesting that his disciples asked that, and it tells us about kind of how people understand how God works at this point, right? That all evils are somehow the result directly of personal sin. And so the fact that this man was born blind had to be attributed either to his parents or to himself, according to this mindset. But Jesus, of course, responds, neither he nor his parents sinned. And he says, rather, it is so that the works of God might be made visible through him. What Jesus makes clear here as elsewhere is that the effects of sin affect all of us, right? And that's not necessarily because one is more sinful than another. That's why they're punished more in what they have to endure, what they have to suffer. In fact, St. Paul tells us the contrary, right? Whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. And so we see that this direct connection of personal sin with misfortunes in our life is not the case. Those misfortunes are opportunities in themselves of exemplifying the power of God in our own lives, as he'll go on to say. He says, "It is so that the works of God might be made visible through him. We have to do the works of the one who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Okay, so Jesus is saying, I am the light of the world, right? And that he is suffering this so that the work of God might be made visible through him. The work of God is the work of salvation, right? And this is a work which God has been working on through all of salvation history. That's why we call it that. So through all of the stories of the Bible, God is working on bringing about the salvation of his people. And God is making this visible now. And in fact, he's making this visible in concrete ways through the healings that he performs as God made man. Jesus Christ healing physically others is a visible sign of an invisible reality, right? So God is making his action visible. God is making his work visible through these signs. And that work, the implication, of course, is that work is primarily invisible, right? Our salvation is not something that we see in a physical way, so much as something we experience within our hearts, within our lives, within our understanding. And so God is promising to work that salvation in our lives, but he's also showing physical signs of what that means. And this is one of those signs, that the blind receive sight, right? Those who were in darkness have received a light. And Jesus himself says, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world, right? And so Jesus's actions, his physical actions, are expressing the work of God that is going on and that will continue to go on within his church. And this idea that Christ works with physical signs is very important to us as Christians, because as Christians we are divided on precisely this point. This idea that in some way God's power works through physical signs. This is how God has always worked, right? We see it, for example, in the recent reading we had about Naaman, who goes to Israel to find a prophet of God who can help him because he has leprosy, and he's heard that Elisha the prophet can help him with that. And Elisha tells him to do what? To wash in the river 7 times in the Jordan. And he kind of in a reasonable way says, look, I could wash in any other river, which is probably cleaner than the Jordan, and it's not going to do anything for me, so why would I do that? And then finally his servants convince him to go. He washes in the Jordan 7 times, and he's cleansed. Now, was it the power of the river that did that? No. Of course, it's God's power. It's not Elisha's power either. Ultimately, it's God's power that does this, and yet it came about only when he followed that instruction, which seemingly is arbitrary, but it's not. There's a lot of meaning to the use of that symbol of water and the importance of the Jordan River and so on and so forth. All of that plays into the fact that God uses that as a sign which leads to his healing. Now, this is the same in today's gospel, in the story that we hear of the person born blind who is told to go wash in the pool of Siloam. It's the same in our sacraments today, that Christ established these sacraments as physical signs. Now, does the sign itself cause the grace of God to become present in our lives? Not in that sense that the material thing has the power to do that, but God chooses to work in this way for our own sake, right? Because he knows that we as human beings work with tangible things. We work with signs. We work with something that's visible, something we can touch, something we can hear, something we can see, even something we can taste, right? And so God continues to work in that way, despite the fact that, yes, what he is accomplishing is a spiritual reality, and yet he gives accompanying signs for our sake. And that's the basis of our understanding of the sacraments, and we can see that at play here in this gospel, as in many, many other places in the Bible, that God works through physical signs. That's not because he's restricted to them, but because he wants to do that for our sake, because we understand him better when he does so. And so this is very important for interpreting really all of Jesus's healings, especially. We can conflate that with Jesus's mission, that Jesus came to bring relief to people who are physically suffering. And he does do that, and he does that out of compassion for those people. But that's not primarily his purpose on this earth. His purpose on this earth primarily is to bring salvation. And all of those healings are signs of what he is bringing for all of us, whether we experience a physical miracle of healing or not within our own lives, that those miracles point towards a reality that all of us do receive from God, which is his free gift of salvation. John continues, when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay with saliva, and smeared the clay on his eyes, and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed, and came back able to see. And we might wonder, what is with this spitting on the ground and making clay and smearing it over somebody's eyes? That seems like kind of a rude thing to do, actually. But it's hearkening back to a reality that the Jews would be very familiar with, and that hopefully we are too, which is the beginning of all things in Genesis, when God creates. And we hear that God creates man out of the clay of the earth, right? And he breathes life into him. And we see that it's God who creates. And so Jesus is hearkening back to the fact that he is the one in whom and through whom and for whom all things were made. He is the creator, the one who makes us, who made us as he intended us to be, and then we turn away from him in sin, and everything gets confused, disordered, weakened, changed. And so one of the afflictions that comes about with sin is every physical affliction, including blindness. And so what Jesus is saying is, I am the one who created humanity as it was intended to be by me, created for love. You turned away from me, but I'm here to recreate, to restore what was taken away by sin. And this is what Jesus shows when he makes clay and rubs it over this man's eyes, that he has the power to recreate because he is the same God who created us. And ultimately what he is recreating is that which we lost with the first sin of mankind. So John goes on, his neighbors and those who had seen him earlier as a beggar said, "Isn't this the one who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is," but others said, "No, he just looks like him." He said, "I am." So they said to him, "How were your eyes opened?" He replied, "The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and told me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went there and washed and was able to see." And they said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I don't know." Okay, this is interesting because we see a very typical response, right? That God is working great things in this person's life, and everybody's very skeptical around him, right? Because they know him well, and they recognize that this person they see in front of him looks like their neighbor, but he can see now. And that's not who he was. That's not who they know him as. And so they say, well, no, it just looks like him. But then he says, no, I am him, right? And this is something that we can see in lives of those who really turn to the Lord, away from a life of sin and turn towards the Lord, right? That there's a tendency for us to be very cynical about that and say, well, no, I know that person. That's not what they're really like. That's, they're just putting on a show or whatever we might accuse them of. But in reality, as Christians, we do believe that Christ gives us the grace and the opportunity to turn around our lives and to follow him in a complete way. And so to be cynical about another person's conversion to the Lord is a very anti-Christian thing, right? And it's kind of like these neighbors who say, no, it can't be the same person. Well, it is, but it is a person changed by the grace of God, right? Not on their own power, by the grace of God. And for God, all things are possible. And then he again recounts his story of how he went to the pool to wash. Jesus sent him, he put clay over his eyes, he sent him to the pool to wash, reminding us, of course, of baptism as well, that renewal of life that comes through baptism. So he tells his story, and they brought him, who was once blind, to the Pharisees. Now Jesus had made clay and opened his eyes on a Sabbath. So then the Pharisees also asked him how he was able to see. He said to them, "He put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and now I can see." So some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a sinful man do such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said to the blind man again, "What do you have to say about him, since he opened your eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet." Okay, so we see this initial response of the Pharisees, that some of them say, well, look, he can't be from God. He's doing work on a Sabbath. So here we see, as we often do in the Gospels, an example of the very strict interpretation of the law that was taken up by many in those times. And, part of Jesus's message really is that the law of charity supersedes every other law, right? Because ultimately, the law of the Sabbath is meant to lead us towards God. And so to serve God on the Sabbath in some way, even when it conflicts with kind of the strict precepts of how you go about following the Sabbath, which ultimately were not directly points given by God, but rather an interpretation of that law of God, which was developed over time, and laws were built around that. Those laws, those precepts were meant to guide a person in following the Sabbath, but ultimately to serve God cannot in any way contradict the spirit of the Sabbath. And so to act in charity comes above all, right? To love God and to love neighbor as ourselves. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind as well, that we can never use that as an excuse just to do work for our own gain on Sundays, right? But that there are certain things, for example, during this time of Lent, you may have given up meat, but you go to a person's house and it's not a Friday and they make meat and they're excited to serve it to you. Well, out of charity, you eat that despite the fact that you gave it up for Lent. Why? Because the law of charity supersedes that sacrifice that you made, and you'll get back to that in a day, but not to let the laws which we put together in order to follow God, not to let those supersede the actual law of God, which is to love Him and to love others as ourselves. John continues, "Now the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and gained his sight until they summoned the parents of the one who gained his sight. They asked them, 'Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How does he now see?' His parents answered and said, 'We know that this is our son and that he was born blind. We do not know how he sees now, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He can speak for himself.' His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone acknowledged him as the Christ, he would be expelled from the synagogue. For this reason his parents said, 'He is of age. Question him.'" All right, so just a note on this. It's interesting that the Pharisees are really just looking for ways to discredit the story. And ultimately, of course, truth is always vindicated by every detail. And so part of what we can gain from this is never to be afraid of those who question the faith, right? But rather to say, the truth of my faith will shine out the more it is questioned, right? And so to be firm in the faith and to look into questions when people have them, and to allow them to ask those questions and to dig into those questions, because we believe that everything which points to truth points to Christ. And so to be willing to answer the questions, to look into the questions of those who don't believe in God at all, the questions of other Christians who generally have anti-Catholic leanings, all of that, that's a good thing, right? To look into that, because that's going to, if we stand in the truth, which we do, then that's going to strengthen our faith, right? Looking into it, rather than shying away from looking into it and saying, well, I don't want to crack that door open because I don't know what's behind it. No, we trust that God is leading us in the truth, and we're willing to go deeper into that, trusting that God is the source of all truth. Okay. A second note is this timidity of the parents, right? They don't want to speak on behalf of or in support of Christ in any way, and so they say, well, ask our son. He can speak for himself. He's old enough, right? This was kind of a missed opportunity for them to witness to the truth, right? And you'd think they would be ecstatic about their son receiving his sight, and hopefully they are, but they let fear kind of get the better of them. And this is something that we need to be on guard about as well, that we can let fear get the better of us and keep us from witnessing to the truth in our lives. And this is something that we need to very carefully avoid. Okay, so John continues. A second time they called the man who had been born blind and said to him, "Give God the praise." An interesting phrase. their implication, of course, is don't give this person, Jesus, the praise. Give the praise to God. Of course, unintentionally, what they're saying is give the praise to Jesus Christ, and they don't know it, right? What they're really asking him to do is to deny Christ, and so to blaspheme. They don't understand this, but this is what they're asking him to do. We know that this man is a sinner, they continue. So we see kind of their mistake here. He replied, "If he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know is that I was blind, and now I see." Okay, this is what the third or fourth time he's repeated his story. And yet they ask him for the details again. "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" So here we see he's starting to connect the dots, right? That his story, the story of his healing from blindness, is something which leads him to discipleship, to become a follower of Christ. And that those who are willing to listen to the story, right? He recognizes that they haven't really listened to his story yet. But those who are willing to listen to and accept a testimony such as his, a testimony of a healing that can't be worked on human power, people who are willing to listen to that are on the first step of discipleship as well. And so if the Pharisees are willing to listen to his story, to actually listen to it, then they must want to become disciples as well, right? And yet he suspects that they're not willing to listen because they haven't listened so far. But he's willing to tell his story again if that is the case. And this is something that all of us need to be able to do, right? All of us experience that change that the Lord effected in our own lives in some way. And it might seem like something small, or maybe something not as obvious as a physical healing such as this one, but there's always something which we know, if we've prayed about it, if we've reflected on our lives, that God has worked in my life in this way and has changed me in a way that I couldn't have changed in myself, or has led my life in a way that I could never have planned for or directed my life on my own initiative, but rather this is God's work in my life. And so each of us has a kind of witness we can give to the work of God in our own lives. And it's a witness that I think, already we see it here, but especially in a day and age like this where stories are much more convincing to people than arguments, that the witness of our own lives is an important thing for us to share and to be willing to share time and time again in witnessing to the work of Christ in our lives, the power of Christ in our lives, and therefore the divinity of Christ. Okay, so he says that to the Pharisees, and they respond by ridiculing him and saying, "You are that man's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we do not know where this one is from." The man answered and said to them, "This is what is so amazing, that you do not know where he is from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if one is devout and does his will, he listens to him. It is unheard of that anyone ever opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he would not be able to do anything." They answered and said to him, "You were born totally in sin, and are you trying to teach us?" Then they threw him out. So we see the Pharisees respond to his question, "Do you want to be his disciples too?" by ridiculing him. And they say, "No, look, you're his follower, but we follow Moses," right? In another part of Scripture, we hear Jesus say that if they had listened to Moses, then they would listen to me, right? Because Moses, as we know, is one among many who points ultimately to Christ. And so to say that they're followers of Moses and not followers of Christ is, of course, a great mistake on their part, yet they're unwilling to listen to reason. And we see that especially in the response of the blind man to what they say, right? He says, he has this argument that God listens to the devout. It's unheard of that anybody should open the eyes of the blind. And if this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do this, right? And they answer him, you were born totally in sin, and you're trying to teach us? And then they throw him out. And in fact, what they're doing is throwing him out of the synagogue, right? And this is quite possibly a permanent expulsion from the synagogue. As we heard before, those who were acknowledging Jesus as the Christ were being expelled from the synagogue. Now we hear that John continues, when Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, he found him and said, do you believe in the Son of Man? So first of all, we see that Jesus, when we find ourselves in trouble or distress on his account, he comes out and finds us, right? And continues to lead us. So we know that this man has already turned towards Christ. He has first acknowledged Christ as a sort of prophet. So he's first recognized that Christ somehow comes from God and proclaims the truth of God. And now he says that he is a follower of Christ, right? He's proclaimed himself to be a disciple of Christ. And then finally, Christ comes to him to lead him the rest of the way. And so he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered and said, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. And so now Jesus proclaims himself as the Son of Man, which is linked to, of course, this conception of the Messiah, the Christ. And so he responds, I do believe, Lord. And he worshiped him. It's kind of a microcosm of conversion, right, in this one person's life, that his life has been changed. He recognizes the good that God is doing in his life. He recognizes the one who has done that good as Jesus Christ, and finally comes to acknowledge Jesus Christ as the Christ and as God. And so he worships him. Then Jesus said, I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see might see, and those who do see might become blind. Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this and said to him, surely we are not also blind, are we? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you are saying, we see, so your sin remains. And so Jesus is pointing to this fact that our own lack of knowledge of sin is something that does mitigate our own subjective guilt for that sin. We recognize that even in just our legal courts and secular courts, but also in our definition of what goes into a mortal sin, right? That we need to be fully aware of the sinful nature of our actions in order for something to be a sin which cuts us off from the grace of God. We need to be aware of what we're doing. And yet he's saying, look, you are aware and you claim to be aware, and so of the things of God. And so your guilt remains. You are blind and you refuse to be healed. And this is something that we need to be careful of as well, because as followers of Christ, we are given the path to follow, right? And we're given that by the words of Christ, by the words of those who preached him in the different letters in the New Testament, and then of course by the teaching of the church, which continues to be enlightened by the Holy Spirit and to teach what has been passed on from the time of Christ and through the apostles. And so we have the means to come to know what Christ wants in our lives. And if we don't make use of that, we can't claim ignorance as a way to mitigate our guilt. Rather, we need to learn more about the life of Christ. We need to learn the teachings of the church and to seek to follow those in order to follow the light that Christ gives us. And so I hope this video helps. Let me know if it does or if it doesn't. And again, I'll try to work on finding kind of a middle ground. Obviously, this video is going to be very long. I don't want these to be burdensome for those who want to watch them. But the idea is to give kind of a wide swath of ideas so that you might find one that you can meditate on, and hopefully we've accomplished at least that. So thanks and God bless.